health and being in great relationships and being able to be in control of your time is like the most important things. In giving yourself that empty space, you actually learn to trust yourself. If you love something, whether it's a person or a hobby or a thing, you end up getting pretty creative and crafty at finding ways to enable it. That thing that you can't describe, but you feel in a subtle way that's guiding you to do something that you get energy by, do more of that.
All right. Welcome to the podcast, Matt. So great to have you here.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
It's pretty cool because I discovered your blog, The Game of One, back a few months ago. And I think I read your article on quitting your job. And I think on the first line, it said
Mhm.
the link to your quitting your job Notion dashboard. And I clicked on it. And the articles that you mentioned, I think were so informative. And I think it opened my eyes to, the whole world of taking a sabbatical and, kind of finding your way back to developing a meaningful philosophy for living a great life. So I just want to thank you for, putting that essay out there because I think it has helped me and as well as so many others as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. When I wrote that, I had not even started my sabbatical, and
Mhm.
creating that Notion page of just a bunch of links to all the helpful articles, essays, and books that I consumed while I was trying to, get to the point of starting my own sabbatical. I just created that, you know, quite quickly, honestly. Like, there's a reason why it's a Notion. I just kind of like, they used to be all URLs with like, all the numbers and whatever
Mhm.
.com backslashes. And most of the work was honestly just um, changing them to like the title and then organizing it. And since then, I'm been really happy to see that people still use it. Like
Mhm.
Notion analytics doesn't give you much, but you can see page views, and I can see that there's actually a few people looking at it every day, which is honestly kind of surprising because it's
Yeah.
just like literally a Notion link.
Yeah. I guess also you can go back to your story and like to give context to the listeners, like could you briefly talk about like your early life and how you've come on your journey to, quitting your job and now taking sabbaticals and doing all the cool stuff you're working on right now.
Yeah, sure. And I'll try to pause at certain points because otherwise I'll just end up rambling.
Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up in Northern Virginia, um, son of two Chinese immigrants who got their PhDs in chemistry. So they had to really study and work hard to make it out of China at that time and then, get their PhDs. I was raised in a really loving and non-tiger parent, like if people know what that means, like not really a tiger parent household. So they never told me like they never like checked my report card and told me what I had to do. And they never even signed me up for like piano lessons or all the stereotypical Asian kid things. I played sports, but I also, was just good at school. I got good grades. And when it came time to apply for colleges, I remember like naively not even applying to Ivy League schools because I was like, I don't want to go to school with pretentious kids. But I still applied to Stanford,
Yeah.
which is funny because like Stanford is definitely in that category of college.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I was like, I would say well-rounded. I had definitely different pockets of friend groups, but I was also just following the herd. Like I
Mhm.
didn't really think for myself. I remember wearing like Sperry's and Vineyard Vines because that's what kids in Virginia wear. And then that sort of trajectory continued into Berkeley and my first couple jobs where um I just continued to like climb that ladder and follow these scripts that society tells us of like you got to get a good grades, get good internships to get a good job out of college, and then you take that job, you work in tech for a couple years, you move diagonally, meaning like you change jobs, but you also get a slight promotion and more pay, and then you just kind of zigzag your way up the corporate ladder. I I was like on that path, but I think there's a couple formative experiences. One is I got laid off in my first job.
Mhm.
Second is COVID. I think that kind of impacted everyone.
Yeah.
And then third was it's not really one moment, but more like a drawn out, multi-phased series of events where basically in my second job after getting laid off, I just started like really going hard at life. Like I road tripped, I bounced around living in Airbnbs. I started skiing, living right by the ski resort in the winter. I was living in Hawaii, doing all these things to figure out like what is the type of life I wanted to live. And that ultimately got me to the point where I was like, I need to take some time for myself.
Yeah. Was there like a moment, I guess maybe in college or during your first couple of jobs that you realized, oh, I'm going on this kind of rat race of life, just checking off the boxes? Was there a moment like that where you kind of had that switch of mind?
Yeah, I think one more subtle moment was when I was working at my first job at Uber. You know, I was living in San Francisco, working at Uber. It was like peak tech bro moment.
Mhm.
And I was like Ubering to and from the office. I was living in Soma, which is a neighborhood known for just like tech offices. Like it's not really a neighborhood
Mm.
vibe. There's no mom and pop cafes or restaurants. I was literally living across the street from Pinterest. As I was Ubering to and from the office, I was staying late until 7 p.m. when dinner was served. So my whole life revolved around work pretty much. And I was kind of
Mm.
like, oh, this feels a little off. There's many weekdays where I don't do anything. Like my weekends were filled with like partying and social events, but like on the weekdays, it kind of felt like I was just revolving around work. That was one thing.
Mm.
And then the bigger thing I would say is in my second job, I was fortunate enough to work with people that had, or like parents of young children,
Mm.
and they also were quite financially successful because they like joined startups earlier. And so I didn't know exactly how much money they had, but I knew they were like well off. And so these were my colleagues. And you just end up like through remote work at that time, you're like, oh, what'd you do over the weekend? I just started to realize like I didn't want my life in the future when I'm a parent of young children to resemble their lives. Not to say that they're like bad people or anything like that, but I was like, I'd get on these calls and I'd be like, "How was your weekend?" They'd say, "Oh, I just got boba with my kids." And I was like, "Oh, anything else?" And I'm like, "Not really."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh yeah, I changed states 3 times and I was like camping on the side of a mountain." And I was just like, "This just seems so different than what I want." And I also recognize that I don't want to be doing that, like all that camping and adventure stuff later on in life. But I just noticed like the difference there.
Yeah, for sure. I guess knowing kind of the wisdom that you know now, would you have gone through college differently? Or, I mean, because obviously we need like a financial kind of nets to be able to
Yeah.
like afford to do whatever lifestyle we want. But how would you approach college differently if you had, the knowledge that you know now?
I think the things I would have done differently in college are less related to like taking a sabbatical and the things I've learned in the recent years.
Hmm.
I would have I would have met a lot more different types of people and really tried to do a lot more new things. Um, so for context, I applied to all these like clubs at Berkeley that are like really competitive to get in.
Uh-huh.
I just didn't get into any of them. They're so competitive, like these consulting and tech clubs. And I felt really defeated. So basically, instead, I just worked a bunch of internships during the semesters. And I think that really helped my career. And I
Mm.
also wish I was like took part in some of those clubs and communities that aren't as intense and selective.
Mhm.
I also wish I took classes outside of the pure EECS curriculum. Like my major was electrical engineering and computer science.
Yeah.
I graduated in 6 semesters and basically like looked at the requirements and was like, what's the easiest way out?
Mm.
Not to say that it was always easy and every class was easy, but I definitely looked at it as like a set of check boxes to get through in the least resistance. Whereas I wish I carved out certain pockets of time in my schedule for classes that were just purely out of interest, like art or psychology or I don't know, just random things like gym class or something.
Yeah, so it's kind of like finding that balance and at the same time being a bit more intentional about, your learning and not just checking off the boxes.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think Berkeley is a very pre-professional setting. Like you're
Yeah.
literally across the
Uh-huh.
bridge compared to a lot of other colleges where you're like kind of nestled in the woods. Like a lot of the Northeast sort of
Yeah,
private
yeah.
liberal arts colleges, you're like insulated in a way where you can truly like tune out from the rest of the world. Whereas in Berkeley, I remember distinctly freshman year, I was waiting outside Unit 3, a cafeteria, and I overheard two people talking, like they're like, "Oh, what app do you have in the App Store?" Like these are other freshmen talking about what apps they have on the App
Yeah.
Store, and I was like, "Holy shit, I've never coded in my life." And
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, I guess it seems like depending on like what college you go to can have, a pretty, big impact on shaping our worldview and like based on the environment that we partake in. Yeah, I guess kind of pivoting back to kind of rediscovering work, because you mentioned that you read Paul Miller's The Pathless Path, which I also read and
yeah.
actually love. And you said that it kind of set the stage of like the dominoes falling for you. So I wanted to ask, like, what was kind of something you really took away from that book?
It was just like this, like
Yeah.
it's not even easy. It's not easy to even put it into words. It was just like this unlock, and also
Mm,
it's. I think I write about it. Like I think I've reread what I wrote about that moment, and
mhm,
in that moment, it sort of crystallized. But I actually like looked back at my journal entries before I read the book, and the seeds were already planted long before that.
mm,
Like I had tried to apply to new jobs, but then procrastinated on interviews because like deep down inside, I didn't want to get a new job. I was already like experimenting with other things, and so it was like both the start, but it was also the end of me like contemplating or feeling like, oh, there's this subtle thing that I can't pinpoint. It was the end of that because it brought it to light.
mm,
But in bringing it to light, it was also the beginning of the 10-month journey contemplating um, how and when and all that, all the fine details of taking a
mhm.
sabbatical.
Yeah, was there anything that like surprised you when you quit your job that you didn't know previously?
There's this really funny moment, literally the day after I quit.
Uh-huh,
So I was living in basically a mansion in South Lake Tahoe on a ski lease with
uh-huh.
a bunch of other people. I say it was a mansion, but it was also because of how many people were on the ski lease, it was like $400 a month. It was a great deal. I was there already before my last day of work. So, I go to sleep in this big house that's right by the ski resort. Woke up the next day, it was a weekday, and I went to go ski during a weekday in the morning with a bunch of other basically, I mean, honestly, old, rich white men.
Yeah.
And I was like, share a chairlift with them. I was like, this is so weird. I just quit my job. I'm like in my mid 20s and I'm broke. I'm not actually broke, but I'm like not making any money.
Yeah.
And the thing that was surprising was like the first day without a job felt very similar to the last day with a job.
Mm,
You sort of in your head, you tell yourself this story that like when you lose your job, you lose your identity, you lose these certain things, but the actual felt sense of the day to day was like pretty much the exact same. I still just went and skied in the weekday, which is awesome.
mhm. Yeah. Was there like did it take some time for it to kind of sink in the fact that you're kind of living this new life?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
going into my sabbatical, I had already had this fine crafted plan of how I was going to write a personal blog, a
Yeah.
climate newsletter, and I did a podcast for 10 months every other week. So every 2 weeks, each one of these three projects would publish something and
Mm-hmm.
had this like very, you can imagine kind of like a pit crew or like a schedule. Like everything was like, oh, it's got to be on time.
Yeah.
And basically, I had replaced my manager at work with a manager in my own head, telling myself I had to go do these things.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, I wish I just took like a month or two and not did nothing, but just didn't pre-plan.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like, I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna hit the ground running. I need to make the most of this time because I'm not making money. Instead, I wish I just gave myself some space to untangle and process certain things that I wasn't fully aware of at the time.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of us are kind of running this script in our head that we have to optimize every part of our lives, even if we're like taking a sabbatical. But like from what you've experienced, like what are some of the benefits you've had from unoptimizing your life and just letting like space come into like your day-to-day schedule and your lifestyle?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good question. The first thing is this big thing of like you just learn more about yourself
Mm,
because it's a lot easier to learn about yourself in these moments of stillness and silence when you can like you're not watching and listening to TikTok videos anymore. You're actually
Yeah.
like kind of listening to your inner thoughts. And you can see for yourself whether those are positive, negative, or anywhere in the spectrum. Um, the other really big shift is that you learn that in giving yourself that empty space, you actually learn to trust yourself with still doing great things, even if you don't, um, rigidly schedule everything and set up all of these like boxes of ways you need to fill time in. Like, if you're working on the right thing for yourself, whatever that might be, you have to sort of figure that out on your own. Then, and you're like taking proper care of yourself,
Hmm.
sleeping, eating right, working out, whatever, then you'll just naturally want to do it. Like, you don't need to be told to do something in order to do it if you
Hmm.
genuinely love doing it and are fulfilled by it.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think like this sort of lifestyle that you've created for yourself, kind of taking like so-called like mini retirements throughout like different parts of the year, do you kind of see that sustainable for the long term? Like, do you kind of see yourself continuing to do that for, X amount of years moving on into the future?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know if
Yeah.
there's a sabbatical number two on the horizon. Like, I still feel like, so I feel like 2023 all year was on sabbatical.
Hmm.
We're coming up on 6 months of first 6 months of year two, still don't have a job. And since then, I've transitioned to coaching and still focused on writing. I would say coaching and writing are my two main priorities right now and how I view my work. And I still feel like I'm at the beginning
Hmm.
of this. And so I don't feel like a strong desire for a second sabbatical. But that's not to say it won't be on the horizon in the future. But the other thing is like you don't need to go on a sabbatical to like I'm not advocating everyone go on a sabbatical and I don't view it as this like huge accomplishment.
Hmm.
There's a lot of other ways that you can find time for yourself. It could be a 1 week retreat. It could just be a day where you just like walk around without a phone
Yeah.
and or journal and just all these things that we've been covering in Downshift, which is the program that I've been helping with. Um, but I think the aspect of your question that maybe is the question behind the question is how can we live in a more attuned way to ourselves and like the
Mhm.
natural rhythms and seasons that we see in ourselves in our energy levels, but also like literally the external weather. Like one of the greatest
Yeah.
lessons I've learned through skiing in the winter and living elsewhere outside of winter is just how different we are and how different we exist in depending on where we are, what we're doing, and our environment.
Yeah. I guess we can kind of talk about the topic of coaching because I'm pretty interested about like your story into it. Like usually when we coach, I guess not only do we kind of help like our clients or the students, I think coaching can also help us, understand more about ourselves. So I wanted to ask, how has coaching enabled you to become a more, self-aware person? And has it helped you in any like shape or form in your own life?
Yeah. I think, well, to answer it in the short version up front, it's like
Hmm.
it's definitely changed my life for the better in many profound ways. There's like this term called self-coaching, which I'm not sure if that's like truly a thing. Like some people might argue that you can't coach yourself, you need another person. But a lot of the techniques, principles, um, like basically I came into coaching not because I was like, what job do I want next? But because I looked at what people were doing, not thinking about the title and the role and what people call themselves, but just looking at what coaches do for their work, but also the type of life they live. I was like, oh, I kind of see that in myself. Um,
Hmm.
the other thing is I would say there were like aspects of coaching that I was doing before I even knew what coaching was. So like when I published that blog you mentioned at the beginning of I Quit My Job, I think
Hmm.
like over a dozen people reached out to me and they were all like, can I talk to you? I want to do something similar. I feel stuck. And I wasn't in a pure coaching mindset at that point. I didn't even know what it was. But
Yeah.
in hindsight, I think people were coming to me for a lot of the same reasons why people seek out coaching, of like looking for someone to be a mirror for them and guide them and ask them questions that allow them to explore more of themselves.
Yeah, it seems like at least I've heard from other coaches like coaching didn't really come to them until like people began reaching out to them, expressing like how much they resonated with whatever thing you put out. So I think that's pretty interesting to point
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, there was a few moments that were all kind of like happened in in a 1 or 2 month period last summer where, this one coach, she asked me to be interviewed for her blog, and
Hmm.
then I was asked to be on a career resources for women podcast.
Hmm.
And I was like, oh sure, okay, I'll do that. Because I also, well, first I got the email and I was like, oh, what is this? Never heard of it. I mean, it's catered for women.
Yeah.
And then I scrolled through like the past podcasts. I was like, oh, I recognize these authors' names. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. Um, and then like this other coach reached out to me, and here I am, like this guy in his mid 20s, no income, just feeling a little bit lost on sabbatical. And I was like, well, why are all these coaches hitting me up?
Yeah.
And so I kind of followed that very faint breadcrumb trail.
Hmm. Yeah, and you kind of mentioned in like your other podcast with Paul Miller how that kind of led you to finding your apprenticeship with Steve and working with the or decelerator program Downshift. And could you
Yeah.
like kind of briefly talk about your story with that?
Yeah. So I I've been following Steve for a while. He's got a big Twitter following. He created this really nice template for people to do their annual review at the end of the year. So,
Hmm.
end of December for like the past 5 years, I've been following his template, and it takes you like 20 hours to fill out. It's really thorough.
Wow. Wow.
And it's become like somewhat of a tradition of mine to get an Airbnb with friends. And like the first couple years, I would actually do it at the Airbnb.
Hmm.
And then I since realized like it's a lot more enjoyable to do it at home and then like just enjoy a couple days of chilling out and relaxing. I usually do it in Sea Ranch, which is like about 3 hours north of San Francisco on the coast. It's a really lovely place. Um, so I've known Steve for a few years, but he didn't know who I was until the start of last year when I published that blog. I quit my job, and he noticed it, and I think he listed it on his newsletter. And then I was like, I think that was the moment where I was like, oh, holy shit, Steve knows who I am.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Um, and then we ended up chatting like a few months later just over video, and then I would say like in the early fall of last year, I spent about like 2 or 3 months thinking about coaching and learning about it, researching. I talked to like probably a dozen coaches just to figure out like
Yeah.
what type of work, what do you do in the day to day, but also how are you showing up? Like I would get a sense of, are there aspects of this other person that I admire, and are they living a life that I aspire to live as well?
Hmm.
Um, I read this book called Mastery by Robert Greene. I think I mentioned this before in that podcast with Paul,
Yeah.
and that is what sort of reintroduced the term apprentice to me. Like that term is in my vocabulary, but I associated with the medieval times where you were like
Yeah.
apprentice with some potter or
Mhm.
some like goldsmith, and you were like some 14-year-old boy, and then or Benjamin Franklin would like print books, whatever. And then I was like, oh, this is a really interesting term. And then also that book showed me that a lot of these great people like Leonardo da Vinci, Charles Darwin, they all did apprenticeships of some form in the past, but that's not often included in their like sort of mini biography when we learned about them
Yeah.
in like elementary school. So anyways, I reached out to Steve, and then we met up in New York, and then reconnected early this year. And that's by that time he had already had the concept of downshift. He had like thought of it by that point. And just so you know, we just wrapped the first cohort a week ago, and then the second cohort will be coming up in the fall. So yeah, really stoked on that.
Yeah, congrats on that. Yeah. I like also the topic of apprenticeship because I've done classical piano for like 14 years and I've had teachers in the past and like I can see like the tremendous value of having a one-on-one mentorship because you can learn so much from it. And like I want to hear your perspective on how you know being as an apprentice has helped you kind of elevate where you want to be in life. And I guess also how you define apprenticeship.
Yeah, let me start with how I define it first, because I think that
Yeah.
is an interesting question that I haven't even fully
Yeah.
explored myself. There, the closest, obviously the benchmark or the thing to compare it to is just a traditional job where you're like an employee and you have a manager
Hmm.
and you're like on a team, right? This is more of like, one person's the mentor, the other person's the apprentice. So there's like two people in a situation. I think the biggest difference is like when you're in a traditional job, your manager gives you certain set of responsibilities, and your responsibilities are not necessarily like the same as the manager's, and you're not trying to necessarily become the manager.
Mm.
They're not necessarily training you to become the manager. In an apprenticeship, you're trying to develop basically the full set of skills that that person has.
Hmm.
And so they are like kind of elevate and like put you in a position where you can basically just like soak up and be a sponge and like learn everything, both like explicitly and just like by being in the room, you can learn so much.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm gonna write a future essay about my apprenticeship. Like I'm still sort of letting all the things like sort of settle in.
Yeah.
We have this gap of about a month and a half, where I can like really prioritize writing. I describe it as like a full immersion learning experience.
Hmm.
Like in a classroom, you're sitting at a desk and you're looking at the teacher on a chalkboard. And it's sort of like that one dimensional. You're sitting there listening and watching the teacher.
Right.
And yeah, sure, there's some peer discussion. In apprenticeship, I visualize like I'm a visual person. I sort of 3D space, I'm floating, and then like from all different directions are like learning in all these different mediums. So
Mm.
to give you specific examples, it would be like Steve would meet with me one on one, and I would bring him whatever I was thinking about or struggling with or contemplating. Then we have Downshift itself, where I'm like in every single call, basically observing. I'm doing all of these tasks where I'm like reading the materials and thinking about how is it relevant to the program. Um, Steve would like introduce certain books and podcasts, and so I'm like listening to that. Then I have my own coaching practice where I'm coaching one-on-one people that are not affiliated with Downshift. Um, and there's more. There's more that I can't think of right now, but there's probably like at least
Hmm.
8 different ways I'm learning. And then basically you're just like, even when you're walking around, you're just like thinking about all these things and just processing it subconsciously. And so I think the like loops of feedback, and because you're learning from it in different mediums, and because you start to be introduced to the same concept, but it's phrased in different ways. So, like, here's one example. I was reading this one coaching textbook and it talks about empowering questions. And then I was reading this other coaching textbook and it talks about powerful questions.
Hmm.
And like they're the same thing. But there's something about like getting introduced to the same concept in multiple ways and terms where you start
Hmm.
to actually triangulate on what's actually important to coaching. Because there's all these different other things that are kind of like loose and on the side, but then you actually hone in on like what is the core and foundations of what I should be focusing on.
Yeah, dude, that's such a brilliant way to put it. Like having that like 3D learning experience versus like a one-dimensional, what most classrooms kind of vouch for. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
for those who like want to get like some sort of apprenticeship experience, kind of what you're doing right now, how would you go about like connecting with kind of the top people in these fields and these areas you want to work for?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question because I don't think I approached it as methodically as like
Mm, I
it.
see.
Okay, so this is what I wrote about in that essay called Becoming an Apprentice. It wasn't like, oh, I want to be an apprentice. Let me like go research the top 100 coaches and let me create a really good cold email template. And then let me rank all
Uh-huh.
100 coaches and reach out to like the top 20 first. And then, kind of go back and forth with 5 different ones and then narrow it down to 3 and then blah, blah, blah. I just like realized I wanted to do an apprenticeship under the realm of coaching. And I was like, oh, Steve would be like, Steve just came to mind because we had connected and we both, knew of each other. Maybe I was lucky in that way where there was already some level of mutual respect in each other's work.
Yeah.
and we had already known each other. So I think there was something about the natural and organic unfolding of how it happened.
Mhm. Yeah,
For
I guess.
someone who is sort of like blank canvas, I do think you need something. You
Yeah.
can't, I don't know if it works if you're like, hey, I'm this kid, I have nothing to show for. Please give me your time. I'll try and help you. I think there's something about demonstrating you don't need to like have made a lot of money or really been an expert in a certain thing. But at the bare minimum, I think you need to demonstrate capacity to learn, to grow, and also a really high amount of like curiosity.
Yeah, I think kind of what you're mentioning here is kind of having like a proof of work. And I feel like, from what I've heard from other people, like kind of putting yourself out there on the internet, whether that's, publishing blog articles or, tweeting. I feel like that can be like a really good serendipity vehicle for, putting yourself in a position where you may become like valuable to someone else.
Yeah, I have, I think that's for sure. Like that's part of it. And I'm wondering like
Mhm.
what is the bigger picture? Because I'm also like not sure. I think it does heavily rely on the internet, but I'm
Mhm.
not sure if it purely relies on creating public content, like sharing things publicly. I think
Mhm.
it's certainly part of it, but you see a lot of like programs and people making money selling basically courses and programs telling people to like write online. And I think some of those are great and some of them are kind of like grifters. I
Yeah.
think the what writing online does is it puts your stuff in a very like accessible way, accessible and approachable format. I think there's other ways too. Like I've heard stories of um if you want to be a video editor, you just like it's kind of like a take home assignment, which happens a lot in PM interviews. You just like do the thing first in like a smaller format. You like edit a video, send it to them. If they like it, then they'll give you a test run.
Yeah. Those are some solid tips. Yeah. I guess pivoting on like kind of the topic of kind of finances, because has like your view of money changed over the years as you've kind of explored and deepened your relationship with work?
Yeah, it's changed a lot.
Yeah.
Um, when I was in college, freshman year, I remember looking at like Berkeley's public info of basically the average salary, average new grad salary broken down by major, and seeing that like the major I was switching to from I used to be mechanical engineering
Hmm.
and switching into EECS would get me from like 80K to 90K average salary.
Hmm.
And I was like, wow, the thought of making 100K out of college, that's crazy. And then my first job out of college, I was making more than that, a little bit more than that, more than my parents ever made. And that was wild. But then quickly, like you start to just spend the money.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I was still saving a lot. Um, but you start to lose the appreciation for what you have, like resources.
Hmm.
I worked 4 or 5 jobs before I graduated high school. Almost all of them paid 7.25 an hour, which was the minimum wage
Yeah.
in Virginia at the time.
Hmm.
Nowadays, I'm driving around Marin County and I see like In and Out advertising a job for like $24 an hour.
Yeah.
And anyways, um, first in the beginning when I was making money, I noticed that I would start to spend more money. I think I began to like become more disengaged with my relationship with money
Mm.
as I became more lost in my work. I was like using it as a way to numb myself, but also like sort of like recoup from or recover from like the lostness I felt or the lack of engagement I felt at work. Um,
Mm.
but also like it was great to just be able to travel and do these certain things. Ski. Um, I would say like the most learning has been since starting the sabbatical. When you don't have money coming in, you get really good at asking yourself, do I actually want this thing? Every time you're contemplating making a purchase. And I think by asking yourself that question, you start to actually know, learn more about yourself of like, what do I value?
Right.
So it's so interesting. It starts of like going to a grocery store, something as surface level and basic as figuring out what snacks you want, to suddenly you go down a rabbit hole of like, who am I and what do I really care about?
Yeah.
It can get deep very quickly.
Yeah.
I would say like it's sort of reversed now where I actually really appreciate money and I want to make money. It feels a much healthier desire
Hmm.
for money. Before it was like, let me just make so much money because I think that's how you live a good life. Now it's like I want to make more money because I want to be live a comfortable life and be able to provide for my future family. So I would say the underlying motivation has shifted into a much healthier way.
Yeah. And I'd say like because you mentioned that you were working like minimum wage jobs and then to suddenly kind of go into like a job where you're making more than 100K, I imagine that's like quite a big shift, not just in like the amount of money you make, but also like the kind of the mental capacity to just try to understand money. It's like a big shock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I had four or five jobs in high school that were like pretty much all minimum wage. I also had seven internships throughout college that ranged from unpaid to something like $55 an hour.
Yeah.
And so it was like a more gradual ramp up.
Oh, I see. Hmm.
But I think it does start to change how you think about your time. Because when I was working minimum wage, I would get 70.25 for an hour. I would have a 30-minute lunch break. And I would basically I would equate what my lunch was during my shift to hours worked because I was like a 15-year-old
Yeah.
working at a private school uniform store. And so there was like multiple times where I would just go to the grocery store down the strip mall and I would buy like a $5 rotisserie chicken and I would
Hmm.
just eat straight up a rotisserie chicken. I was also a growing boy. Um,
Yeah.
and it was like less than 7.25. So I was like, oh, this makes sense in my head.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you also wrote, I think, an article about like stepping off the hedonic treadmill in terms of like money and like kind of like
Yeah.
obtaining material possessions. And like for those who are kind of stuck into that, like how would you advise someone to kind of step off of that and realize that, oh, you don't need as much money as you need to live a great and fulfilling life?
That is that is just the ultimate question, right?
Yeah, yeah,
I think I think I think rich people pay people a lot of money, like basically coaches a lot of money to help them answer this question. Like I think my approach was basically a full reset.
mm,
I don't know if you need that, but I would say like getting really comfortable in the discomfort of being like, what are all these like consumption behaviors driving?
mm,
Um, what is essential? What is non-essential? How can I enable this thing? Like, okay, let me give you a concrete example.
mhm,
Um, People often think skiing is a super bougie, luxurious sport that's reserved for the ultra wealthy, and it's not. And the way I came to realize that it's not is by loving skiing so much that I wasn't willing to give it up during my sabbatical or
mm,
even now. Like I
yeah,
want to ski every year and I want to do it full on. Like I want to live by the ski resort. I don't
yeah,
want to do these like bullshit 3 4 hour road trips to Tahoe from the bay, like ski in a line on a Saturday and then go home and be super tired and not even have skied that much.
mhm,
When you have these constraints, there's like this phrase like creativity breed or constraints breed creativity, something like
mm,
that. When I placed myself under these constraints of like, I don't have money coming in, let me figure out how to preserve the essential aspects of skiing. I got really good at doing it for like a very affordable rate. I was basically buying a season pass and everything else, you just have to spend money on anyways, like lodging and food. I wouldn't buy food at the ski resort. I would buy groceries. I'm really good at finding great Airbnbs.
mm,
And I think if you love something, whether it's a person or a hobby or a thing, you end up getting pretty creative and crafty at finding ways to enable it.
yeah,
And if it starts to get really tough to make it happen, then you get this like underlying desire to be able to find resources, like make money to keep it going. Um, I think the problem is where people are like working as investment bankers or private equity or whatever, making like 500K a year, and they're just like buying watches and going out to eat at Michelin star restaurants, not because they actually like those things, but because they see everyone else doing them with around their peers. I think
Mm.
that's where, you know, it's just like, what is the underlying, um, is it coming from a place of like devotion, or is it coming from like a place of like um herd mentality or obligation?
Yeah, so it's like kind of like narrowing our focus down to the few things that actually matter to us instead of being swept by the, plethora of options that we have that society tells us we have to pursue all of them.
Yeah, I think if
Mm.
you really know yourself and what you want, and you and so you like you narrow in, and then you're able to more closely stick with those things because now you're not trying to do a ton of things, then the feeling of FOMO and jealousy just like kind of dissipates because you're doing what you want.
Yeah. And I guess for those who kind of want to create that lifestyle, do you like a well-paying job is a prerequisite to kind of creating the lifestyle you want?
I feel like I don't know if it's an absolute, but in my
Hmm.
case, I will certainly acknowledge the privilege that I had in not only like having a high income job, but having a remote job.
Mm.
Like
Yeah.
my lifestyle in Hawaii was just like amazing. I literally had a view of the ocean of where I would surf. So instead of checking
Yeah.
surfline.com, which is the website where you check the wave report to see if like are the waves good, like how many people are there, I was just like look outside. And I had a moped with a surf rack and I could get to the break in like
Mhm.
10 minutes. And anytime I wanted poke, it was like 25 bucks a bowl or whatever. I would just like not even think about it. There was like there was a certain amount of privilege that I had
Mm.
that I gave up. Um, but also I think scratch the whole Hawaii story. Like I think what it actually enabled was like I was able to run a lot of experiments on the type of life I wanted to live.
Yeah.
There was a certain level of flexibility and freedom that having financial resources enabled me to have. So when people are like, how do I find, if someone's wondering like, how do I find my purpose? How do I find the life I want to live? Um, this is less so an observation about money, but it's more so I strongly believe that you find it by doing rather than thinking.
Mm.
So you can't just like get a library card and go check out like 1,000 books for free at the library and read all these philosophy books on what it means to live a good life, which would cost $0 in theory. You have to have a certain amount of financial resources to go out and like try living in different places, to try
Yeah.
out new hobbies,
Yeah.
to uh yeah, try new things.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm curious, like how did like your parents kind of view your experimentation with life? Was it like positive, negative, or kind of in the middle?
I think it's been really positive.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My dad unfortunately passed away when I was 19, freshman year.
Oh,
That's why I was saying earlier. So in the recent years, it's really just been like me and my mom. My mom's been super supportive. I think she'll listen to this. So shout out to my mom. Yeah, never
yeah.
been
Mhm.
putting pressure, and also just like having a home. Having a home is such a lovely thing to have that I appreciate a lot. Like not just a home where I go there and feel loved and supported, but literally a home where I can like store all my gear.
Right.
That's why I've been able to not have a lease for 5 years and switch between living in New York and then I'm like nature ski mode every winter. Like all those things are I very much appreciate.
Yeah. I guess speaking on like kind of the topic of kind of bouncing around different locations, like you're staying at New York, right? Currently?
I'm based in New York
Yeah.
normally, but now right now I'm in Palo Alto.
Hmm. Yeah, so are you like more like a seasonal traveler, kind of you staying at New York for several months and then during like the ski winter times you kind of go somewhere else?
Yeah, right now
Hmm.
I think that's what it feels like. People are always like, "Oh, you're a digital nomad." I'm like, "No, I don't really relate to that."
Hmm.
Um, because I feel rooted and grounded to where I am.
Mm.
Even though I don't have a lease, even though I'm not living in one place for 12 months a year, like if you take the average person that lives in New York on a lease, they're also not there for 12 months straight. They're also going on vacations and going back
Yeah.
home and taking like a few weeks here and there. I just do it in a way where like the default assumption is that like I don't have to be in this place. I choose to be in this place. And I only travel and live in places that I've been to before. So and what I say is like instead of visiting and traveling to new places, it feels like I'm just moving between homes, just in a
Mm.
much more humble way than like being a multimillionaire with multiple homes.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. Yeah. I think you also mentioned in your tweet that you'd prefer living in NYC over SF because kind of its emphasis on like living a good life outside of tech. So I wanted to ask like how important is like living in a city that kind of actively encourages you to live a good life?
I mean, it's so important, but the thing is,
Yeah.
what a good life means to you is
Right.
determined by you, not the people in the city.
Mm.
It also depends on what chapter or in phase you are in life. Like something that I have started to believe is every one of our desires has a expiration or a time window. And that time window could be a whole lifetime. Like, oh, I want to be healthy. Okay, that's like for all of life, right? But this, think about how for several years I thought I was just gonna like live in hostels every time I traveled. And now I last year I stayed in a hostel a couple times. I was like, I think this might be the last time I want to really stay in hostels and like
Hmm.
share a room with 8 other strangers and deal with someone snoring at like 3 a.m. But coming back to the city thing, like it really depends on what you're looking for at that certain moment in life.
Yeah.
And I mean, is like what is your it might help if like we talk about your situation and what you're thinking about. I mean, I know you're like a few years away from actually thinking about moving, but
Yeah, I go to college in LA, and I guess,
Mhm.
based on personal taste, I prefer being back in the Bay Area because I'm a bit of a more quieter person. And I feel like
Mhm.
LA is like it can get pretty loud, extroverted sometimes. So I think it's harder than the Bay Area to find, quieter spaces where you can be in solitude. But that's I guess all based on personal preference. Yeah.
I I would challenge and encourage you to find the other introverts and quiet spaces in LA. LA is a really
Yeah.
big city.
Yeah.
Like East LA is so different than Venice and Santa Monica.
Yeah.
Malibu compared to, I don't know, Hollywood, right? Like there's just the city, the where to live and the city question is very important. And we must not use it as an excuse to not try
That's
to
true.
do it ourselves
Yeah.
and make the most of where we are. I mean, I don't think you're gonna like it doesn't sound like you're gonna drop out or transfer. So for the next 3 years, I'd encourage you to just like find your people
Yeah.
where you are rather than think
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
how much better it could be elsewhere.
Yeah, it's like the whole like the grass is greener analogy, which is kind of false because you kind of have to find your own place wherever you're rooted in and just trying to make the most
Yeah.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we can finish off with a couple last few questions.
Mhm.
Like what is something that you've grown up believing to be true but turned out to be false?
Um, hmm. Well, I mean, the obvious one is I used to believe that like constant growth in terms of career and money and prestige was what I wanted, is what everyone wanted. Now I'm realizing
Yeah.
it's not the case. Um, and I also used to sort of believe that like the only quantity or the only way to assess value is in the form of money.
Yeah.
But like there have been there have been moments where I realized there's value in many other forms. I think the other big thing,
Mhm.
which has, I think you can only realize this if through direct experience. But if you've ever spent time with um, basically rich people, you start to get a better sense of what's actually important. Because I wouldn't call myself rich, but I've been around rich people.
Mhm.
Actually, I met someone who works for a billionaire. I've met a billionaire. Um, and you just realize like they're all humans and health and being in great relationships and being able to be in control of your time is like the most important things.
Right.
Um, and money is really only valuable up until like it can get you what you want and enable the life you want. Like these billionaires, like
Yeah.
they're kind of living a lifestyle really similar to people that are not billionaires.
Mm.
The toys are just bigger. The food has gold flakes.
Yeah.
Like not too much that's different.
Yeah. I guess like it's kind of how money is just a vehicle to, the things that actually matter in life. And after that, more wouldn't do that much of a difference.
Yeah, but
Yeah. Hmm.
I think the thing that doesn't get spoken about this is like it's actually really it can be very illuminating to experience what it's like to have no money and to have a lot of money. So in my experience, how this has shaped, you know, being on sabbatical, I had the security of savings, but I put myself in the situation where I was like, okay, I'm gonna live frugally and humbly. And that's how I got really good at figuring out how to like ski on a budget. But I also experienced like the other end where, I've been on business trips where like I flew business class from Sydney to San Francisco. It's like a $6,000 flight, and I was able to lay all the way down, and a like 16-hour flight felt like 2 hours because I was sleeping the whole time.
Yeah.
I've stayed in five-star hotels and eaten at like really fancy restaurants. I was staying in a hotel in India, and we put our laundry in the hotel laundry, and it was $800.
Well,
So like you
yeah.
experience things like that, and you're like, okay, that was cool, but like, do I really need the money to be able to do that over and over again? Like, not really.
Yeah.
Um, so I think experiencing both ends of the spectrum helps you hone in on where you want to be. Like, I don't look down on people that are like, I want to live a very lavish lifestyle. If that's truly what you want, that's great. But at least know what you want.
Yeah. Seems like experimentation is just key in this, in like how we want to live a life. Yeah, and I guess we
Yeah,
can finish off with one last question, or it has kind
yeah.
of two parts. But what is like a piece of advice you believe to be overrated, and as well as a piece of advice you believe to be underrated?
Hmm. I feel unprepared for this. Let me think about it.
Yeah.
Um, hmm. I think the line of advice that's like push through the pain or like build healthy habits, maximize productivity, grind through it, um, outwork your competition, no pain, no gain. I think that stuff is overrated.
Hmm.
One, it like doesn't always work. Two, there's like confirmation bias. There's like a lot of reasons why I think that is fading. Like I don't even know if it's overrated because I already see that it's being appropriately downsized in
Yeah.
how much people buy into it. Um, and I think the underrated advice is something like follow your curiosity, listen to your heart, trust your gut. Um, sort of like all these like pretty abstract, spiritual, borderline woo-woo concepts that are like that thing that you can't describe, but you feel in a subtle way that's guiding you to do something that you get energy by.
Hmm.
Do more of that.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks for all your thoughtful answers, and I I learned a lot from it, and I'm sure anyone listening would learn a lot from you and your story as well.
Yeah, man, thanks for reaching out. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. All right. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next. All right. Peace.
Yeah, keep me posted, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
To seeing it.
Oh, last question, I guess. Anyone who wants to hear more about like your story, where should someone find you? And I know like we mentioned
Yeah,
like your essay and I guess your Notion dashboard for
yeah. My personal website is mattyao.co, mattyao.co. I'm on Twitter, Matt__yao, and I think people can find like my Substack from there and all the other things. And
yeah,
feel free to reach out over email, Twitter, whatever. I'm here to help.
yeah. Substack's called the Game of One. So
It's gonna change soon.
oh,
I'm
all right.
renaming it. I actually just
Uh-huh.
self-edited that. You'll see it. I'm renaming it,
All
so
right.
the
Yeah.
URL will
Looking
change
forward.
too.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much. And
Awesome. Thanks, Justin. See ya.
yeah.
Have a good weekend.